Okay, nice to be here. I'm going to just say how I met Jeff. I read GKPS in late 1985 and early 1986 and was utterly seduced. At the time, I had a formal mind and found a series of typos and mistakes, which I very presumptuously emailed to Jeff and Gerald. And Jeff sent me back a document that was titled The Complete List of Typos and Errors in GKPS. And some of the things I found were not in that, which made me a person of interest. And we, after that, arranged to meet at the LSA Institute in 1986. And that was the beginning of a great collaboration and friendship. So we're going to talk about lexical B, what exceptions tell us about the theory of grammar. And we're going to start by the phenomenon, a corpus investigation, explaining the range of meanings and differences in acceptability of lexical B, criticize Collins' minimalist approach, provide a brief constructional analysis, and a few theoretical implications. So we are using the classical Hudson terminology where auxiliary means verb having the nice properties, whereas a lexical verb is a verb that doesn't have the nice properties. And the usual assumption is that B is always an auxiliary, even when it's the copula, so that auxiliary doesn't have the etymological meaning in English grammar. It means verb having the nice properties. Now, in fact, B, copular B, can sometimes be used as a lexical verb undergoing due support and SAI, as in, why don't you be the judge, or why don't you be quiet, where B, copular B, appears to be functioning as a lexical verb. I'm not going to do the detailed literature review, but this has been known at least since the 50s. I will briefly mention what Huddleston and Pullum say about this in what is the most detailed information on the topic that we have found. So beyond the why don't you be constructions that I just mentioned, they note that these can appear in the third person. Why doesn't he be more tolerant? They also note the existence of a second construction. If you don't be quick, you'll lose. If he doesn't be quick, he'll lose. And they note the following points, descriptive points. The why construction is virtually restricted to the negative. It has a meaning similar to the imperative. The if construction conveys the idea of should. So if you don't be quick, you'll lose, conveys you should be quick. For some speakers, the if construction is possible without negation, but not in the third person singular. So some people allow if you be quick, you'll win, but standard English doesn't allow if he be or be's quick, he'll win. Collins provides the only substantive theoretical discussion of this, which we will discuss later in the paper. And there's a paper by Kelmer, which I won't talk about, but it has some interesting information. So in order to get a little bit more information on this, we did a corpus investigation on the COCA using the queries that are here and which are just about certain to recover almost all of the relevant cases. The data was conducted, data collection was done in 2019, which was before the large expansion of the COCA where they added several registers. We found 65 occurrences plus a small number of clearly non-standard occurrences, which we eliminated. All occurrences were either from the spoken register or were instances of reported speech, which led us to investigate the SOAP corpus, which is a corpus of 100 million words from American soap operas. Note that this is a little bit smaller than the spoken COCA was at the time. It's different from the spoken COCA in that there are no news programs and things like that. There's only just normal dialogue, conversation. And we found 143 as opposed to 65 for the COCA, so clearly more. The construction is typical of dialogue, of conversation, which is not surprising since as noted by Huddleston and Pulham, as we will confirm, it has typically a directive meaning, which of course is linked to conversation. Now, what the corpus investigation showed us is that the data are extremely skewed, which is really important, which I think is something that, as Chris was doing, you need to take into account if you want to understand what's actually going on. So out of our 208 examples, 170 are the why don't you be quiet type construction. Then there is the if you don't be construction, which Huddleston and Pulham mentioned. There's also a construction which they don't mention, which is how do I be the real me, which is in our corpus data slightly more frequent than if you don't be, but much less frequent than why don't you be. And then there are a couple of isolated constructions which account for about 2%, less than 2% of the data, which we'll return to later. So we've confirmed the existence of the two constructions from Huddleston and Pulham. We've brought to light a third construction, the how do I be construction, which we'll come back to later in the talk. Other skewing in the data, constraints on subjects. Second person accounts for 90% of the why don't you be construction and 75% of the if you don't be construction. For how do I be, first and second person are equally represented. We'll come back to this later in the talk. Third person is extremely rare, less than 2% of the data overall. So there's enormous skewing on the subjects. Constraints on polarity. All of the why don't you be and the if you don't be constructions have don't. All but one of the how do I be constructions are positive, do. Constraints on the form of do. All of the occurrences are do or don't, except one of doesn't, two of did, and one of didn't. So again, we have 0.5% of the cases in the corpus that don't have do or don't. And I'd like to point out that the absence of the past tense use with the first and second person is really surprising because they make perfect sense. Why didn't you be quiet? Why didn't you be the judge? Meaning you should have been quiet or you should have been the judge. These sound perfectly fine, but remarkably, we get one case of actually no cases of this type in the corpus of 208 examples. Directive force strongly dominates. It's always present with why don't you be. It's typically present in if you don't be. There are cases where there's no actual directive force because the addressee is not the subject. And there are also cases, so if she doesn't be careful, she just might end up. That's not a directive. But in those cases, there's a clear deontic or desiderative stance or a combination of the two, which is clearly linked to the directive. So if I take something like 17, how do I be like you? That involves something like I want to be like you, or I should be like you, or some combination of both. Constraints on the predicate, and specifically first the semantics of the predicate. Typically, be plus the predicate denotes an activity under control of the subject. And this is shown by the fact that the progressive is possible. So why don't you be honest with me? Are you being honest with me? Or why don't you be a real friend? You're being a real friend. These are cases where the predicate combined with be denotes an activity under control of the subject. And of course, this is not surprising that we find these because of the directive interpretation. For the directive interpretation to be possible, we need to have something like this. Other predicates, less frequently, are not usual activity predicates with agentive subjects. They resist the progressive, but in the context of why don't you be and of the imperative, what's crucial is that why don't you be patterns with the imperative, an agentive reading is coerced. So you get things like, why don't you be a detective or something? Your being a detective is really not very easy to contextualize, but be a detective is a perfect imperative. Or last example, why don't you be alone for a while? Be alone for a while is just as good, but you are being alone for a while is hard to contextualize. As for the category of the predicate, we get mostly APs and noun phrases. PPs are less frequent because they typically don't have the right kind of semantics. So, all in all, the predicates appear to be exactly those that are possible with the imperative uses of be, both with respect to category and with respect to semantics, which, again, is unsurprising given the directive semantics of the construction. So, to summarize the corpus findings, we find that the distribution of lexical B is highly skewed across the different parameters analyzed, and this is a problem for any theory that suggests simply that B can function as a lexical verb, because that will allow everything in. It argues in favor of a constructional approach to the phenomenon, which allows you to keep track of idiosyncrasies and establish constraints across various levels of grammar. You're not on yet. I have one more section. Sorry. We didn't really have time to rehearse. So, we need to account for the fine-grained generalizations that we uncovered in the corpus data, and we're going to start with the most frequent construction, the why don't you be construction, which accounts for more than 80% of the occurrences. We want to account for the form, namely the sequence why don't you be XP, the negative polarity, the person of the subject, which is typically you, and the tense, which is the simple present. Our hypothesis is that why don't you be is a blend which inherits properties of the more general why don't you directive construction, why don't you go home, and the negative imperative with subject construction, don't you go home. So, the why don't you directive construction is used to express weak directives, suggestions, invitations. It enters into a gradient of decreasing deontic force with the imperative, sit down, the should construction, you should sit down, and weakest, why don't you sit down. Our hypothesis is that why don't you be arises from the pressure to make this full gradient available with actional predicates that are most naturally expressed with be plus predicate. So be specific about what you want, you should be specific about what you want, why don't you be specific about what you want gives us the third level. The blend between why don't you directives and nominative, negative imperative with subject is facilitated by the formal similarity, they share the string don't you V, and the semantic similarity, they both express directives. Negation is present in why don't you be because it's present in why don't you more generally. The construction is always negative. Why don't you sit down is typically interpreted as a directive but can be interpreted as an information question. Why do you sit down can only be interpreted as an information question. So the negation comes from why don't you be. The person properties are inherited from why don't you and reinforced by the negative imperative with subject. So here you have the SOAP data for the general why don't you construction on the left hand and the why don't you be on the right hand, and you see that there's a very similar skewing. Third person is almost unattested, just as in our case. The stronger skewing in favor of the second person we suggest comes from the fact that in the negative imperative with subject, you always get the second person, except in those very rare occurrences of the type, don't everyone talk at once, where you get a third person subject. But those are very rare occurrences. Restriction to the present tense does not come from why don't you. Why don't you is well attested with a counterfactual deontic reproach meaning in things like why didn't you tell me with a past tense. The restriction to don't comes from the negative imperative with subject constraint, where the form is don't. There is one case in the past tense in our corpus data, and we assume that this is an ad hoc extension of the construction where the formal link to the negative imperative is overridden. So, once the lexical be construction is established in why don't you be, it can be extended to further constructions where it keeps most of the same formal and semantic properties. only 2 such constructions have any degree of productivity in our corpus data, the if you don't be and the how do I be constructions. So for if you don't be, look, if you don't be careful, this whole facade of yours is going to come crumbling down, meaning you should be careful, or this preserves the central properties of why don't you be, the directive interpretation, second person subjects, and the don't form. How do I be is interesting, it's more different. It shares WH interrogative status with why don't you be. It shares the present tense of do, but not the not. And the interpretation is rather different. You, in something like 36, how do you be a mother to 4 children with everything else you do? Contrary to if you don't be and why don't you be, you does not refer to the addressee here. It's a generic you, which is understood as applicable to the speaker. And the other typical case is an I, where it's clearly the speaker. How do I be the real me means I want to be the real me, or I should be the real me. How do you be a mother, blah, 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 means how do I be a mother as a case of the more general generic you. Clear? And from the point of view interpretation, you get this deontic desiderative modality combination, and the subject is first or second person interpreted as generic. So beyond these 3 central constructions, we find in our corpus 7 occurrences comprising 4 constructions, among which things like 37, 38, and 39, where you should note the presence of deontic meaning. And I think that is crucial to the acceptability. So for instance, in 37, should I try to help save these lives, or do I help my 3 children, or do I be with my father on his deathbed, where the deontic modality expressed by should is clearly applicable to the 2 other conjuncts. Or in 39, so you have to work with him around that, so you don't be that controlling with him. Again, there is a deontic modality here that makes the construction more acceptable. So if one randomly searches the internet, it's possible to find further possibilities. You can find why don't you be in the past tense and even in the third person singular. You can find other types of WH questions. You can find declaratives and polar interrogatives, but these are rare occurrences and they often show independent signs of sloppy writing. The 3 productive constructions are why don't you be, if you don't be, and how do I be. And you need a corpus investigation to realize that. Peter's going to talk about Collins. He just gathered data from the internet with no idea of what was frequent and not frequent. We argue that other uses are ad hoc extensions. They are more likely to be produced, and they're going to be felt to be more acceptable if they conform to the semantics and formal properties uncovered, especially to the semantic property of deontic force. And with that, I give the floor to Peter.
So I should say before I begin that the reason why I'm here and working with Philip is I was visiting Paris in 2018, and Philip asked me if I would be interested in working on this, and obsessive English grammarian that I am, I agreed. Is that in the CJEL?
It is.
I couldn't find it. Okay, so I looked and I looked. So just to be comprehensive and careful, we should look at what Collins says. So Collins assumes that there's 2 verbs be. There's an auxiliary be and an agentive lexical be. And he develops an analysis based on the assumption that only semantically vacuous verbs can move into the info in English. So this is the sort of classical analysis of the inflectional morphology in English and French and so on. It goes back to Pollock. And the assumption is that agentive be, this lexical be, doesn't move to info because it's not semantically vacuous. he assumes that lexical B has semantic content and hence can't raise to info, and this is illustrated, the raising of the vacuum of the non-semantic B is in 40, and the failure is represented in 41, where you get to support because you don't raise the B to info. Now, what we're going to point out is sort of obvious, but it needs to be said since this stuff does get published, which is the idea that the English auxiliaries are semantically the idea that the English auxiliaries are semantically vacuous is untenable. Possessive have can function as an auxiliary, as in have you any idea of the implications of what you're saying? And the modal auxiliaries are clearly no more vacuous than verbs expressing evidential modality like seem or sound, which are lexical. So Collins is using this notion of semantic vacuity simply to code the auxiliary versus the lexical status of these two B's. And we're following Rothstein in assuming that there is actually only a single B, and that the differences in the adjectivity don't have anything to do with the B, it has to do with the predicate. It is also the case that hypothesizing a lexical B doesn't account for the data. So a genitive B doesn't have to be lexical, it can be an auxiliary, as in 42. If you aren't quiet, bad things will happen, which is the same as if you don't be quiet. And if you hypothesize an agentive lexical B, then you're predicting, other things being equal, that you should find it in places where you don't. And we've been discussing at some length here where you find it and where you don't. Specifically, simply postulating agentive lexical B fails to account for the marginal status of examples that don't conform to the narrow conditions that we have covered in the corpus investigation, in Philip's corpus investigation. So we don't find, did they be quiet in the car? We don't find, when did they be quiet? In those cases, you have the auxiliary B. So Collins' data are really not representative. He notices the construction. He works with data that he's found on the internet. That's better than using introspective data, just as a general practice. But it fails to bring to light the relative frequency of the various subconstructions. And in fact, what he does is he sets aside the most frequent construction, which is the why don't you be. And of course, he has no way of accounting for the variable frequency and acceptability of the data. I wouldn't say that Collins couldn't account for the frequency. He just has to build it in somehow, and that's something that people don't do in this type of work. Anything is possible. I am now stuck. Now, wait, what happened? How did that happen? Okay. So the data suggests, and we could have concluded at the end of the last section, that what we have in our heads is constructional, that we have representations of correspondences between meanings and forms. And I like to use Ray Jackendorf's way of thinking about this in the parallel architecture to represent this information that we have about language, and this knowledge that we have about language, and we use subscripts to kind of show the connections between the various pieces. So for a simple lexical item, we have the phonological form, the syntactic category, and the corresponding semantics. We can do this for more, what does that say?
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Thank you. So for idioms which have variables, we can represent it using the same bookkeeping system, basically. And of course, for very general correspondences, very general rules, called rules, we can use the same formalism, generalizing away from individual lexical items. For the imperative in English, we can express the construction more or less this way, where the bare form of the verb, with or without a subject, has a directed force to the addressee. We don't have to say what the phonological form is, that follows from other considerations. And for the negative imperative, which is somewhat more restrictive in English, you have to say something special, because you can't just predict what the negative imperative is going to be in English, knowing that it's imperative. You have to know that you use don't, that it precedes the subject if there is one. Otherwise, you get the bare form of the verb. Using the same approach, you can express the particular unpredictable details about the why don't you construction in the form of where you get a why and you get a don't and then you get you. And that's something you just simply have to know. You can't predict that either. It's constructional. So here we just have the same picture as we have a picture of what we said before, which is that both the negative imperative and the why don't you have properties that are basically recruited to support the why don't you be construction where the verb is be and it has the directive force that is borrowed from those two other constructions. Represented here. So basically the idea is that what we have is a network of constructions, particular pieces of knowledge about language that we've acquired, and then we generalize and borrow from specific constructions to innovate, create new constructions, including innovating beyond the constructions to produce ad hoc instances that share some of the properties of the constructions, no problem. So why is this important? Why do we care? Well, we do care because we have rather idiosyncratic knowledge of constructions in our language, which we have had to acquire. And in order to acquire them, from experience, we have to have certain mechanisms that support this acquisition. And if we can explain how we acquire the rather specific knowledge, and rather idiosyncratic knowledge, and how we use that knowledge to generate novel constructions, then we will have a story about how we acquire the big picture, the general, because if you can acquire the very precise, the very idiosyncratic, then you certainly should be able to acquire the general. So then we can explain in general how we have knowledge of language. So that's why we're looking at these little pieces. And that is it. Thanks.